When you need your warehouse looking good while staying efficient, there's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Pallet Rack City is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a great rack? Pallet Rack City. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Beliefs expressed on the following program by the host, guests, or callers are not necessarily the opinions of FantasyXS.com, Media Group Inc. ownership, management, sponsors, or website. Time for an hour of hardcore hoops with the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint program with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro. There's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Let's get to the show basketball fans crave. Let's get inside the paint.
Welcome to Inside the Paint. Hey, happy Wednesday, everybody, and happy Wednesday, Ira. So are you back home now after the world travels in Sacramento and Las Vegas?
Yeah, you know what? It was a worthwhile endeavor. Sometimes it gets a little bit too much, as we saw by some of the ragged play. Even yesterday, Clay, we saw the Heat. They sat out Omer Yurtseven. They sat out Max Strus. They sat out Marcus Garrett. They knew what they had. So it's interesting. Usually a season builds towards a climax. At Summer League, even if you look at the crowds in the stands, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Everyone wants to test their guys. No one wants to overdo it in the offseason. The Heat saw what they needed to see. Like Malik Allen, the Summer League coach, said after the game yesterday, everyone deserves a chance. That's what they tried to do in the loss to the Mavericks yesterday. Never about the overall record, just about what they saw. So, yeah, Clay, incredible. They started August 1st at a summer camp in Sacramento. They finished August 17th. So, no, there's no offseason in the NBA.
Well, and we just got training camp starting, September 28th. So
6 weeks. 6 weeks from yesterday,
so,
yeah.
You know, what I want to focus on today is, first off, you fired up another big debate among Heat fans on social media with some of your latest questions that you answered and asked Ira. So we'll get to that a little bit. But, you know, I want to focus on specifically what you mentioned about Summer League, and you saw what you needed to see. And I think from a Heat perspective, there are different levels to this. And so I want to talk about these guys up towards the top of that, which are Yurtseven and Max Strus.
Sure.
And what do you think, based on what you saw in Summer League, what were you thinking going into this about what their projections were, not just for this season, but also beyond that? And did anything that you saw in Summer League kind of take away or change what you thought moving forward for specifically those two guys? And let's start with Yurtseven.
Yeah, I was going to say there's two very disparate kind of situations. I actually addressed the 10 things we learned from Summer League at sunsentinel.com. That just posted. It'll be in tomorrow's Sun Sentinel, so you can get the sort of full breadth of the 10 things I broke down. When you look at Omer Yurtseven, think about this, Clay. On August 1st, the Heat are getting together for summer camp in Sacramento before they play 2 games there in the California Classic. And they announced they're not picking up this season's team option on Omer Yurtseven. So there's a party who was going, well, that was fun. He showed up the last week of the season, played for Turkey in Olympic qualifiers, and he's gone. Instead, they brought him back, typical tryout kind of contract. And how remarkable, 2 games later, on that Tuesday and Wednesday of that same week, he's so dominant against Sacramento that they signed him to a 2-year contract. And I got to tell you, a lot of times we talk about undrafted players, and we also talk about untested and unproven. Clay, this is a guy who played for the Turkish national team, has international experience. This was a guy who was a professional in Turkey before going to college. The rules have changed. They allow that. So this is a savvy neophyte type of player. And you're seeing it with the Heat. He can block shots. He can score in the post. He has a 3-point touch. He can seal his man and get inside and create a good catching pocket for his passers. So I really wonder, and we'll talk about Max Strus in a second, who I call a rotation player, but you know that Omer's a roster player. And as I wrote in my Ask Ira today at sunsentinel.com, I would not be surprised if he challenges Dwayne Dedmon for backup minutes at center.
And that's the thing that's got people fired up right now. So I do want to get into that in a little bit, but take me back, because I want to talk about the contract situation with Yurtseven and the fact that they did not pick up that option. So you're wondering Do you think there was a something in their minds that said, we don't want to pick up that option because then we don't have the team control then beyond that option, to where if he does go out there and ball out like he did, we sign him to that 2-year deal, then all of a sudden we have a little bit more control relative to his contract and his potential future. Do you think that was a part of this?
Absolutely spot on. Clay's been studying his NBA CBA there. That's absolutely spot on. When you're in the NBA for 2 years, under 2-year contract, you become what they call an early bird free agent. You can get up to the average salary, which is pretty good average salary, about $10 million a year now. So that's what the Heat did. They didn't want to lose him after a year. They'd have to use cap space, which they won't have with all the large salaries they signed. They'd have to use a cap exception, which you'd like to save to sort of churn through your roster. That absolutely was the thinking, Clay. A lot of times things are not as they appear. There's a strong relationship with the agent. They were able to work through that situation. They have him now, and it's a great contract for the Heat. 1 year at the minimum and a 1-year non-guaranteed team option. So you know what, Clay? If it all goes to crap, if he becomes the latest, and we've seen plenty of these, one-time Summer League wonder who cannot translate it from Summer League to the NBA, you move on. This is the smart stuff that you and Big O were talking in our crosstalk about, smart front offices, about planning ahead, about things not always being what they seem. Andy Ellisberg, Adam Simon, Pat Riley, the Heat front office did a really good job with that one.
So when you're going into this thing and you see that move, and I think a lot of people had the same reaction that you did. It's like, oh, well, that was fun. He must not have shown them enough to give him the. No, it was actually quite the opposite, that they had seen what he was doing and they're like, wait a minute, we don't want to risk. We want to make sure that, hey, if he is the guy that we think we want to have that longer control. So I'm glad that you cleared that up. Now let's get to what is causing kind of this debate, this firestorm, which is, can he really challenge Dwayne Dedmon for minutes? And I think part of this, Ira, is Dwayne Dedmon was somebody that, first off, there's this craving for a big. And,
yes.
And it's something that Heat fans have had for a while. And I think probably it's gone back even deeper than this. But I think what happened in the playoffs, not just this past year, but also the year before in the finals, when, the Lakers were able to kind of muscle them off the floor early part of that series, people seem to forget that the Heat kind of turned the tide on that thing. And they had eventually played Dwight Howard off the floor. But then you saw the season go on this past year, and in particular in the playoffs against Milwaukee, where it was straight up ugly. And it kind of, I think, reaffirmed people's feelings that they needed that big, right? So Dedmon comes in, and man, if you look at his per 36 minutes numbers, he was incredible. But it was a very small sample size. Like, he would go out there and just, it was man, energy level through the roof. So when you talk about Yurtseven, where do you think that he could push somebody like Dwayne Dedmon, who has already shown some decent things in his minutes on the court?
Dwayne Dedmon is the 10-year veteran, the guy who's been around, knows the league, savvy. He's not going to get punked by other power players. You need that. But offensively, he had that brief stretch where he was hitting three-pointers in Sacramento and Atlanta, but not really looked at as an offensive threat. And Clay, you and I have talked about how the game has changed in the NBA. That if you're not live as a scorer, and we'll get to Casey Okpala later, you're not necessarily good enough to be on the floor. I think Omar Yurtseven at this point, no disrespect to Dwayne Dedmon, is a more skilled offensive potential player than Dwayne Dedmon is. So you want to see the combinations. And Clay, this has been a debate. I know that you and Will Manso on Local 10 have discussed this also, is Eric Spoelstra's reluctance to play two true big men together. The only time we've really seen it in recent season was Kelly Olynyk and Bam Adebayo together. And that worked. That was effective. Earlier in that season, spot starter Myers Leonard, but never really anything that endured. I want to see if the Heat can go big, because Clay, you mentioned it. In that series against the Bucks, they were punked off the court. They were destroyed on the boards. The Heat's power forwards, again, are not big. They've gone on this cycle from Jay Crowder. Then this past season, they moved to Trevor Ariza. Now there's PJ Tucker, always been undersized. Markieff Morris, maybe more of a 3 than a 4. So I really want to see the possibilities of big and big. And just like the Heat explored possibilities in Summer League when nothing was at stake, I'd like to see the same thing in the Heat's preseason schedule. Put Bam, put Yurtseven out there, see if it works. If it doesn't, hey, lesson learned, no cost. But if it does, that's when I think you may have to reconsider some of Dwayne Dedmon's minutes.
It's really simple here. Spo doesn't want to play two guys in the front court who can't shoot three-pointers, can't stretch the floor. And so I think that's why you saw some of the Bam and Kelly Olynyk minutes a lot, and then some of the Bam and Myers Leonard. It's not a coincidence that both Myers Leonard and Kelly Olynyk were standing out at the three-point line a lot. So I think a lot of this will come down to which one of those players can effectively stretch the floor. And I think the thing with Dedmon is the energy that he brought. And there were certain times in games, especially when you get to the dog days of the season, where sometimes you just need that infusion of life. And I think what Dedmon brought to the floor was, and this is what I think is kind of at the heart of this debate that's going on right now, is he brought that energy, and I feel like he kind of endeared himself to Heat fans while doing that. And the numbers were great. But to your point, unless and until somebody can go out there and stretch the floor next to Bam, does it really matter? And eventually, in Spo's mind, because you're never going to see it. Or here's the flip part of this: what if all of a sudden Bam becomes Chris Bosh and steps out and starts hitting three-pointers?
And that's the next iteration, and we're waiting for that. Remember when he was about to be drafted, he came in. I think he hit something like 70 out of 100 3-pointers, and they were saying he's a threat. And then, of course, you don't want to take him too far outside. This is another problem for the Heat. When you become too versatile, I think it can almost hamper you for this reason. And I wrote about this in one of my Ask Ira questions today. Bam Adebayo defensively can guard anyone, right, Clay?
Yes.
The first play of every game, they play a 1-5 pick and roll. Bam switches out on the opposing point guard, smothers the crap out of the guy, and there's no one inside to provide defensive deterrence.
And then,
so you have that.
Then you get Duncan Robinson guarding DeAndre Ayton or Rudy Gobert or Nikola Jokic. I mean, I remember that West Coast trip. I was like, okay, we get it.
Stop
we get
switching.
Stop
switching. So you have that. Now, offensively, if you're going to move Bam to the three-point line, you're going to remove his offensive rebounding. He's going to become a perimeter big, which is fine only if you're going to play too big so Omer Yurtseven can duck in there for the rebound. So even when you mentioned Myers Leonard and Kelly Olynyk, which had worked marginally, neither of them were great rebounders. They just weren't. Myers Leonard would always talk about, I'm boxing out so someone else can get the rebound. No, get the damn rebound. Kelly Olynyk has never been known as a great rebounder. He has a different skill set. So Dedmon will get you man-sized rebounds. I think Omer Yurtseven, after he trains with the Ferrans, Eric Ferran, the current strength coach, Bill Ferran, the strength coach emeritus, will build up that body that he can do that also. The Heat have to stop getting bullied. They were bullied out of the postseason last season. They were bullied to a degree even by the Lakers in the NBA Finals the season before that. They have to show some muscle. PJ Tucker gives you muscle. Markieff Morris will give you muscle to a degree. But you need the muscle and you need the length also. That's why Yurtseven mania is running rampant around here. You don't get guys who were that skilled, that big, that long, and potentially that strong. That's what made it a special thing.
And guys, make sure check out the comments section. Drop some comments there. I'm going to get to some of the questions that you guys might have here because we like to kind of keep this interactive, and this is probably the best way to interact with us here. And, Duncan got that bag, definitely. Could you see the Heat trading a player for Rondo? I want to talk about that coming up in the next segment because I still think you and I discussed this a bit last week. It's you think that maybe Gabe Vincent could potentially step into that backup point guard slot, and yet you don't know. And until you know, there's still kind of that hole there. C. Dollar says, finally, Ira, I've been saying that. Omar, what's going on? So bottom line with all this stuff, what you saw from Yurtseven, because we want to wrap this thing up in the context of what we saw in Summer League. What you saw from Yurtseven was enough to make you think that he has the potential to play alongside Bam and be that guy that they did. Look, if he gets with the training staff. So, when you see the development of guys like Duncan Robinson and players in the past, look, you say what you want about Tyler Johnson. He's somebody that, he wasn't worth the contract he eventually signed, but he was an effective player for us. So there are these success stories that come out of that, and potentially Yurtseven is that guy. The question is twofold. Number one, how quickly does it happen? And number two, we're looking at this in a vacuum. Where is the next step in Bam's development to how he would play with one of those players?
Yeah, and again, that's all you want is you want to explore possibilities. You have summer league for that. You have preseason for that. You want to have the pipeline. Yes, this is an old team. We discussed that last week. We discussed that when the Heat started adding all these players, the Lowrys and the Markieff Morrises and the PJ Tuckers and Jimmy getting older. But it's nice to have that sort of second wave, especially a team that has no second-round draft choices ever. A team that is at least out of one future first-round draft choice, and depending on what the Kyle Lowry investigation shows, might be added 2 first-round draft choices coming up. So if you can maintain that pipeline, and I love the arrogance of the Heat. You could have your second-round picks. You can have your late first-round picks. We got Adam Simon, we got Chet Kamara, we got Keith Askins, and we're going to show up in Summer League with our fancy unwrapped gifts, and people are going to go to their GMs and their scouts. How'd you miss that guy? Why didn't we draft that guy? What happened over there? There is an arrogance to the Heat scouting that has paid unbelievable dividends, and you have to feel that's happening again right now with what they uncovered in Omar Yurtseven. Not overstating him, but as long as he's a factor in the rotation, or at least a factor, in the lineup and in the roster, you're moving toward the right direction.
Because those are the holes that we're looking to plug at this point, right? So it's not that we're saying he's going to go out there and he's going to all of a sudden start next to Bam and average 15 and 10. It's okay. What is this team lacking? So I figured that we would get on this topic and we'd end up spending the whole first segment talking about Yurtseven, and we wouldn't even talk about Strus. So I want to talk about him coming up. I do also want to discuss the possibility of Rajon Rondo and somebody that you mentioned earlier, and you said we're going to get to, KZ Okpala. And where does he stand? You talk about the arrogance of the Heat staff. And
sure.
Yeah. I mean, you bring in these and yet you spent what 3 second-round picks?
3 second-round picks
in order to get Okpala. And so where is he right now in the Heat organization? Where do they view him? And could these things kind of tie together with potentially bringing in a point guard? Could Okpala be a part of that? So, man, we got a lot to talk about. We've already talked about quite a bit, but I want to get more into Strus and the backup point guard situation coming up next, right here on Inside the Paint.
You're listening to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a good rack? Pallet Rack City. Sports fans love a place with great food, cold drinks, and TVs everywhere. That's why sports fans love Sports Grill and their 7 amazing locations. Check out the Bird Road location at 11481 Southwest 40th Street in the back corner of the West Bird Shopping Center. Sports Grill is also now offering some great employment opportunities. All kinds of positions are now available from kitchen to hosting. Call for more information at 305-485-8845. From wraps to salads to amazingly delicious specialty dishes, Sports Grill is the home to the legendary special grilled wings. Since 1987, Sports Grill, good food, good drink, and good friends.
This is the Big O Show. 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 This is the Big O Show.
There's no need to drive around South Florida wasting valuable time looking for a new or certified pre-owned Acura. Go to the #1 volume sales dealership in the Southeast United States. Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. Purchase with pace and space in a dealership tailored to your needs. From home buying to providing that personal touch. Contact the 2020 Satisfaction Award winner Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. 888-776-5123. That's 888-776-5123. Or visit them at 15601 Pines Boulevard in Pembroke Pines.
When you need your warehouse looking good while staying efficient, there's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Pallet Rack City is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a great rack? Pallet Rack City. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. If it's hardcore hoops you desire, make sure you subscribe to the Big O Radio Show and never miss an episode of Inside the Paint. Let's get back to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro.
Welcome back. Big O Radio Show Inside the Paint. Ira Winderman joining me. Hey, Ira, so as usual, we went way too long in the first segment.
You know what? But I want to say one thing about that, though, Clay. That's why we do the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show for an hour. Because, you do other radio hits. You've been on, Local 10. You get your couple of minutes here or there. It's nice to go deep into a subject and not just have to give the cursory kind of comments. And then people all of a sudden, on Twitter, they're saying this guy can't play. They're saying this guy's great. Right. That we get a chance to offer the contractual perspective, the developmental perspective, the roster perspective, and that all factors in. Quick takes, hot takes are great. We do those sometimes also. That's what social media is for. But it's nice to show up here every Wednesday morning, 10 o'clock, Pallet Rack City, Inside the Paint, and go more in depth. No place on the web, no place on the radio dial are you going to get 17 minutes of hard-hitting Omar Yurtseven talk. That's what we're proud of here. And also, we're huge in Turkey because of that. Go ahead, Clay.
Look, all joking aside, he's the guy people are talking about right now. So, I think you get to a certain point where it's like, we know what this Heat roster, the top of the roster is going to look like. So the question is, how are you supplementing that? And then what's next? So with that in mind, I want to talk about Max Strus. And, I think he showed enough during the regular season to make you kind of raise an eyebrow and say, all right, he's going to be in that next wave of guys who, I don't want to say come out of nowhere, but do kind of come out of nowhere.
Sure.
That they're going to be the guys that the Heat developmental staff turn into somebody who's going to be a contributor. The question is, to what level? And what I loved about what he did in the Summer League, Ira, and you were there, he did the things that I think we knew he could do, the shooting and some of the stuff off the dribble that I think he's better at than I think we thought. And yet the thing that stood out to me was the big game, the big moments in the game. And you could sit there and you could say, oh, well, it's just Summer League and whatever. Those moments in the game, the high stress moments, the high leverage moments where, hey, it's put the ball in a guy's hands. The same feeling, the same pumping that goes on in your chest goes on in Summer League, goes on in the regular. So to me, Ira, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like the fact he was able to show in those moments that he's able to kind of grab hold of what he needs to do, I thought that was really encouraging.
Well, let's look at it this way. Alonzo Mourning, Tim Hardaway, Shaquille O'Neal, LeBron James, Chris Bosh, Dwayne Wade never hit a game-winning double overtime sudden death shot to win a game. Max Strus did that with the double overtime rule during Summer League. So it shows that he has big whatever you want to put it. But yeah, Clay, he showed a game across the board. He also rebounded. He also defended. He also made plays. He also led. And what I wrote about in my Ask Ira column is, I think the biggest takeaway I get from Max Strus is this, and I think this is important. Now when Duncan Robinson comes off the floor, the Heat at all times for 48 minutes can have a shooter on the court you cannot leave. Yes. It's called creating gravity. He's there. He's in his orbit. Someone has to watch him. No one can double as much on Bam or Jimmy or Kyle or anyone else in there. That's what the Heat came out of Summer League with. Now, unlike, as a matter of fact, I'm going to put this back on you, Clay. Last season, Duncan Robinson goes out of the game. Who spaces the floor for three-point shooting when he's off the court? Maybe is 15, 16 minutes a game, maybe gets in foul trouble. Who was the guy who you felt comfortable enough with, okay, we could put him in it and still make threes at a high rate?
Well, it was only Strus, and it was because I was like, man, I kind of like what I see out of this guy.
Sure.
And but like to your point, we hadn't seen it consistently yet to where you could say, okay, yeah, he's going to be that guy moving forward on a consistent basis. So like that to me was, I would say the most impressive thing was you're going to see that confidence grow, and you're going to see him feel like, okay, in those situations, I can do that. So let me take this a step further.
Sure.
We all know that Pat Riley is willing to trade anybody. Like to me, I always tell people The only jerseys I'd be willing to spend any money on are 13, 22, and 40. Like
Mhm.
beyond that, I don't think you can count on anybody being there. So when you see Duncan Robinson sign a $90 million contract,
Sure.
I wouldn't run out there and be so quick to buy a number 55 jersey, because you never know what's going to be on the horizon. And the Heat always have their eyes on who the potential next star is going to be. If the Heat were to ever make a move for a star, you still are you're going to change your offense, but you're still going to need that element of shooting
Correct.
in your rotation. So what this showed to me was Max Strus is getting closer to replicating what Duncan Robinson can do in your offense if he gets injured, right? And that's going to happen.
Foul trouble, things like that, sure.
He is going to be able to come close enough to replicating what he does in the offense. Now, is he going to have the same sort of effectiveness? No, because Duncan Robinson's one of the best 3 or 5 guys in the league at doing what he does. That's why he got $90 million. But what I think you want to make sure you have is that element. So what it showed me, Ira, is that you have so much more flexibility now with what you can do in your roster because he's showing what he can do.
Yeah, and again, because he made himself a roster player, and even Malik Allen, the summer league coach, mentioned this also. This was not just about Max shooting threes. It was about showing he could be a more complete player, which he did. He has a good frame. He's a thick player. He can body up on you. That matters. That's why they've tried to work on Duncan Robinson's frame, and he really has changed and resculpted his body, so that matters also. Because again, when you look at the guard rotation, Clay, to start this season, we're all hopeful that Victor Oladipo comes back and becomes a factor. But you're probably starting the season with Duncan Robinson, Jimmy Butler, and Kyle Lowry as your 3 wings, including the point guard there. You're probably saying your next wing off the bench is Tyler Hero. But you're going to need one more guy in that mix for sure, for foul trouble, for back-to-backs, for injuries, and things like that. I don't think the Heat knew if they had that, didn't know if they needed to add another player. Now I think there's greater confidence. And I want to go back to what I mentioned about three-point gravity also. You can make three-pointers, but if the opposition doesn't know about you and respect you, they're still going to leave you open.
Right.
So it's more than that. What Summer League did, and Malik Allen mentioned this, it gets you on the scouting report.
Right.
Omar Yurtseven put himself on scouting reports in Summer League. Max Strus put himself on on scouting reports in Summer League. So now at FTX Arena, when they're in the visiting locker room and they have the whiteboard there and they're putting up keys to the game, you know what? You're going to see Max Strus's name up there. You're going to see Omar Yurtseven's name up there. You wouldn't have with Max Strus last season. That's why Summer League mattered also. Hey, we saw this kid in Sacramento. We saw this kid in Vegas. We got to watch out for this kid. He can dump 20 on you if you don't. That's why these 2 weeks were so important. He got on the scouting report. Now, part 2, now that they know who he is, can he show that he's even more?
Yeah, and I think it's not even just that. We're not even saying that these guys are on the scouting report immediately. Like Strus is. And so that's what I said in the last segment. There are different levels to this. And so to your point, because you brought up, Art, they didn't know if they had that extra wing player in the rotation. There's another wing player that we had just mentioned that they spent 3 second-round picks on. Obviously a far different player. But I think as excited as you were if you're a Heat fan coming out of Summer League about Strus and Omer Yurtseven, I still think you got to be scratching your head about the other player that we mentioned. That's KZ Okpala. Where does he fit? Does he fit? And where is the vision you think for him to stand right now compared to where it was when they drafted him?
Well, I'm going to go back to just last week when I wrote my story about how the Heat really have only 8 proven elements in their rotation because you still don't know about Yurtseven and Vincent and Strus. You're hopeful, but you don't know. And we also know that Victor Oladipo is going to miss at least the first half of the season. And we also know, I'm sure we'll get to him at some point, that Udonis Haslem will have towels waving the whole time during the game, maybe break a chair, maybe go in and break a cooler in the locker room, but he's not going to play a lot also. So the question was, are you going to have 3 players like that on the roster who can't be factors, one being KZ Okpala? Clay, I was a little heartened yesterday by what he did. And again, I know it's just Summer League. I know Dallas ended the game with only 6 players. But I've been saying to myself the entire week in Vegas, what can I make out of KZ Okpala? What can he be? I knew he could be a defender, but you know what? They had 4 or 5 other defenders on their roster. There's a bunch of players like that. That's heart, that's hustle, that's effort. That's one thing that a lot of people could bring to the table, but you got to play on both sides. At least yesterday in the game against Dallas, as I look at this box score right here, you could see that KZ Okpala hit 4 3-pointers. Clay, if he can at least be a 3 and D player, you might be able to use him. If he can't make threes, he is so, I don't want to say dysfunctional. That's a little bit harsh of a word, but so lacking in offensive areas that you can't put him on the floor. You're playing 4 and 5 on offense. So I would hope as much time as he's put in this summer with the Nigerian national team, showing up to Summer League, playing in Las Vegas to the very finish, he's got to go to the gym and make that 3-point shot something, corner 3-pointers like Keith Askins, like all the other Heat and 3 and D players. If he can do that, at least he can become usable. If you're asking me today, what is it, August 18th, whether I think that KZ Okpala can be a rotation player for the Heat, I do not, because the anomaly was the one game against the Mavericks to end Summer League. Otherwise, he's been lost on offense. He's a defensive hustler. This team needs more than a defensive hustler if they believe they can be contenders this season.
All I have to do is point to a couple of words in that, which was if and might. Like, if you're sitting there saying, if he can do this, then he might. Like, how much of a stretch does it have to be? And I'm with you. I think, unfortunately, you're sitting here and you're like, this is, when we look at somebody like Strus, I think you're pretty confident that he can go out there, like you said, and be a rotational player right now. Because he showed some things last year that made you feel like that already. Then he goes in Summer League and backs it up. You see Yurtseven, and you're like, man, he has stuff that just does not exist with a lot of players in the NBA. So if he grows into that role, there's so much that KZ Okpala has to improve upon. And you're right. I mean, if it's
3 years in,
right. Like at some point you are who you are. And I think, was it Daryl Morey who said a few years ago that, after 3 years, you kind of know who a player is.
Right. And
it's rare that you have somebody, he was discussing it in the context of Clint Capella, that it's rare that you have a player that after 3 years, you start to see this big leap. Like, you can see small growth after that, but it's rare that. So you're sitting here looking at like, okay, when are we? Now, part of that is that they knew he was a developmental prospect coming out, and he is still young. And but at some point, and this has been a weird couple of years, and yet at the same time, you want to see more. So I think this is an incredibly important offseason for him. The 6 weeks that we have left of it, to be able to prove that he can get there. Yeah,
3 years in the league. This was his first summer league, so he didn't have the typical rookie scale and build up. A lot of people have said, maybe you're seeing this in the comment section now, he needs to go to Sioux Falls, play in the G League, get churn minutes. But Clay, that's a tough call because it's also the end of his contract. Right. So you also want to see what he is in an NBA context, because you will have a decision to make. Spoke to someone with the Heat, very candid with me. They said they were really hoping that it was KZ and not Precious, the player who was thrown in with Goran in the deal to Toronto to get Kyle Lowry. That they felt there was more upside with Precious, and we saw it. He had a 19-point game, had that huge dunk in one of those Summer League games. That's really He might be one who got a little bit away. I don't know about KZ. So again, he's had this very unusual rookie first 2 season arc. He has to make up for lost time now. But it's interesting, Clay. If we go through the rotation right now, I'm just going to throw names at you. Just say yes or no, okay? Do these players definitively play ahead of KZ Okpala, okay? Bam Adebayo.
Of course.
PJ Tucker.
Yes.
Markieff Morris.
Yes.
Duncan Robinson.
Of course.
Jimmy Butler.
Of course.
Kyle Lowry.
Yep.
Tyler Hero.
Yes.
Omar Yurtseven. Okay, put number 8 as a maybe, okay? Yeah. Max Strus.
Yes.
Okay, Gabe Vincent.
Yes.
Okay, so either 10 or 11 players are ahead of KZ Okpala.
And you didn't even mention Dedmon.
And Dedmon also. So, okay, so let's say 11 or 12 players ahead of him. So that's the thing is, whether he could do it or not, you have to show me at some point in a certain time frame, or else the train leaves the station and you have to move on. So you're not, hopefully, we're not going to get the COVID games again. We're not going to get that 2-game series when you're in Philadelphia and you have 8 players and barely enough to push through and anyone and everyone plays. Hopefully you won't have enough garbage games at the end of the season where you're either locked out of a playoff seed or locked into a playoff seed where guys can just get run. So I don't see many opportunities out there. I would have thought he can contend for backup minutes at power forward. He's shown nothing. that tells me he's in that position. So again, maybe some Sioux Falls, maybe some more preseason, but I think the train has sort of moved on there, for better or worse, for fair or not fair.
And you hit on something there when you were talking about Akpala, about potentially going to Sioux Falls, and you want to see it in the context of how he does with the NBA, with NBA players. And I want to tie this into Udonis Haslem coming back. And you mentioned UD and what his role on the team is, because we got a couple minutes left in this segment. And, you know, I think it's the constant debate amongst Heat fans. We started this off with the debate that you fired up with Dwayne Dedmon versus Omer Yurtseven. But this thing with, like, what is Udonis Haslem really worth the last spot on the roster for the Miami Heat, when you could have all these other developmental players come in and be in the gym? I think the thing that I always fall back on with this, Ira, is if any player, and KZ Okpala is kind of the one who's the outlier here, because he's already, you know, we're already talking about 3 years in, he needs to see what he's like with NBA players. Any developmental player that would be taking Udonis Haslem's roster spot would be much better served to be in Sioux Falls anyway and get actual minutes and then come in. So the way I've always fallen on this, Ira, is the last roster spot on the Heat should go to somebody who is going to help the Heat win a championship, going to help the Heat win. And Udonis Haslem plays a much bigger role in that, with all of the stuff that he does off the floor and his presence in that huddle, than a 14th, 15th player who'd probably be better served getting real minutes in Sioux Falls anyway.
Except this season is the exception, because they're only carrying 14 because of the luxury tax. So they're not filling, at least till later in the season, as of now, that 15th spot.
But who are you missing? I guess that would be my question. Who are, like, who
I'm missing honestly, I'm missing a backup point guard. I'm missing a veteran guy like a Jeff Teague, who, if he doesn't play at all, he's used to that. And when Kyle Lowry misses 10 games, I don't have to force, and we can talk about this next segment, Gabe Vincent into the equation, whether he's ready or not. That's what I'm missing. Who am I missing? Clay, you made a very good point about developmental players, but if they're not under contract to you, and in Sioux Falls, anyone can poach them. If I can get a Marcus Garrett or a DeJon Jarreau under contract and then send him to Sioux Falls, then he's my player also. This is a much different situation. You're not filling roster spot 15. So he's at 14. Only you have Victor Oladipo not playing half the season. Only you have KZ Okpala, who you're carrying through the final part of the season. That's the difference. Usually you would tell me this: Ira, I've got 14 functional players. Who gives a rat's butt about 15? I also got 2 two-ways. And I go, damn it, Clay Ferraro, you're right again. This is a different kind of season, and that's the difference.
This is why you're a pro, Ira, because you didn't even know it, but you led me perfectly into what I want to talk about in our last segment, is that backup point guard spot. And there's a name that's out there. And I know that the Heat can't sign anybody because of the tax. And like Pat Riley said, you don't want to go into the tax. I'll never forget that news conference. The tax. Well, the tax is there, and Mickey Urson doesn't want to pay it. So
more to it than that with the repeater tax. We'll get to that also.
I understood. And yet when you don't have – but I do think that there's a name out there, and there will be potentially more names that you can find a way to bring in. So let's talk about that coming up next right here on Inside the Paint.
Reach out to Ira and Clay. Drop them an email at insidethepaint@yahoo.com. Chime in on the YouTube chat board. You're listening to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint Show.
There's no need to drive around South Florida wasting valuable time looking for a new or certified pre-owned Acura. Go to the #1 volume sales dealership in the Southeast United States. Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. Purchase with pace and space in a dealership tailored to your needs. From home buying to providing that personal touch. Contact the 2020 Satisfaction Award winner Craig Zinn's Acura of Pembroke Pines. 888-776-5123. That's 888-776-5123. Or visit them at 15601 Pines Boulevard in Pembroke Pines. If you're a Miami sports fan, then there's only one store to go to, and that's Caneswear at Miami Fanwear in Davie. They're your one-stop shop for all your inner Miami CF, Canes, Dolphins, Panthers, and Marlins merchandise. They have hats, t-shirts, game day jerseys, and so much more. Located at 2511 South University Drive in Davie, and open 24/7 online at caneswear.com or innermiamiwear.com. Call them at 954-835-5597. Caneswear, the spot where Inner Miami and all Miami sports fans shop.
This is the Big O Show. 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 This is the Big O Show.
When you need your warehouse looking good while staying efficient, there's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Pallet Rack City is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a great rack? Pallet Rack City. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Welcome back to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint program with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro. Let's get back to the guys that just updated their email from Prodigy to AOL. Here's Ira and Clay.
The AOL joke gets me every time. Winding it down here on Inside the Paint, Ira joining me. So, you texted me something last night. We go back and forth on what topics we're going to discuss. And one of the things that you brought up that, hey, let's get right to it. If this is the end of this roster, if you look at the roster as it's currently constructed, is this enough for the Heat to compete?
Oh, it's interesting, your word choice there, because you could say compete or contend.
So contend.
Aha! Now you already raised the bar within 10 seconds here.
Always contend.
I consider contending making at least the conference finals, making the Final Four. I'm not sold right now, not as much because of the Heat roster, but because of the competition. Look, we don't know who the final two in the West are going to be, but they'll be pretty darn good. But if you're asking me, is this Heat roster better than Brooklyn's roster? It is not. If you're asking me, is this Heat roster better than the Milwaukee Bucks roster? It is not. If you're asking me, could this roster contend with the 76 rosters? It can. If you're asking me whether it can contend with the Celtics and Knicks, it can. So I think this team can compete. I don't think this team can contend right now. Now, you have 82 games for someone to step up, for the next Duncan Robinson to arrive, for Bam Adebayo to put himself so firmly in the All-Star discussion. There is no debate about who's going to that game on the 75th anniversary in Cleveland this year. So there's time for that. But right now, contender, no. Competitive, yes. And I think, Clay, as we know because of the machinations and the tax, it'll all have to come, at least for now, internally.
So two questions in about that. Did you feel the same way 2 years ago going into the season where the Heat ended up making it? Did you feel like that was a contending team that year?
To use my expert analysis, hell no.
That's where I was
right.
at.
And again, you get to the playoffs and it's wide open. And I do agree, Clay, this team is built for the playoffs. But it used to be just get to the playoffs. I remember Shaq mumbling, doesn't matter what seed you get, I've won for the first, fourth, and he's won championships from all the seeds. The difference is what happened last year in the NBA, the play-in round. No longer can you just pussyfoot around and say, I'm going to get a top 8 seed and move forward. Got to get a top 6 seed. And Clay, you remember that final week of last season, those 2 games in Boston, the Heat had to win both of them. They did. They survived. They didn't go to the play-in. The Celtics did. So it's a lot tougher now to say, we're built for the playoffs. We're going to rest guys. We're going to get there. Even in the East, I'm not saying it will happen, but I'm saying in the Eastern Conference, with Milwaukee and Brooklyn and Philadelphia and Boston and New York, at least, you might have to fight for number 6. So this team has to still find a way to competitively get through the regular season also. That's where my questions might be as well.
Well, that's fair. And I guess what I would say is, when we're sitting here on August 18th and we're trying to figure out, is this team a contender? I'll always fall back on, I didn't think that team was going to make a run in the bubble. And it changed. I still, to this day, like if you put those rosters on paper, the Heat and that Celtics team, the Heat and that Bucks team, and this was before Ben Simmons got hurt and Joel Embiid was there were a number of teams that I would have put ahead of the Heat going into that Eastern Conference playoff run. So I will forever look at this in the context of, I feel like this team, especially with Jimmy Butler, I feel like they can do it if they get there. So
That's another question.
So this is the only reason why I'm going back to this is because I want everybody to understand the context where we're coming in. We're not sitting here being naive, pie in the sky, saying this team is going to go out there and win a championship. It's very easy, and I'm with you, that I don't think this roster is as good as Brooklyn and Milwaukee. But if they get there, I feel like they can compete and make a run. So is there anything they could do today on August 18th or between now and September 28th when the training camps tip off? Is there anything they can do to change your mind and make you feel like they can, short of landing a star, a true star?
Well, again, I know where you're headed. So could they? Yes. Will they? I'm not so sure. To explain to people the luxury tax, and look, I can't stand this line of reasoning, and I'm sure you're getting it on the text line. Why is Mickey Arison so cheap? The luxury tax is not a matter of dollars spent. The Heat have spent into this stratosphere when they were the ultimate contenders. Teams like Brooklyn and the Warriors are doing it now also. But the repeater tax comes into play and can cripple a franchise when you're in that repeater tax 3 out of a 5-year period. Every player you sign a minimum guy. We're seeing this right now in Brooklyn. A guy for nothing, a guy for beans. And all of a sudden you're talking about an 8-figure hit on your luxury tax. So you have to be prudent. It's like saying, why doesn't Mickey Arison have a gazillion ships that he can fill? Well, you only have so many port berths to the port of Miami. So you have to conduct business within the confines of what you have. So the Heat go into the luxury tax if they sign any other player and fill that 15th roster spot, whether it's a former All-Star, whether it's a developmental player. Would I like to see this team add another veteran point guard? I've only been saying that for about the last 15 years. Does the Heat have the wherewithal right now to do it? No, they do not.
So, and clarify this for me, because you said 3 out of 5 years for the repeater tax. How many times have they been in the tax the last few years?
They were in the tax, I believe, 3 years ago. They're putting off that clock, but, and I might be wrong on that number, but this is what matters more, Clay. When you now factor in, starting this season, Bam's extension, Kyle Lowry's contract, Jimmy Butler's contract, $90 million over 5 years for Duncan Robinson, I don't think they'll be able to avoid the luxury tax in the next couple of seasons. So, again, that goes back to our argument, compete versus contend. So if you're just having competitive seasons, but not necessarily contending seasons, is that when you want to put yourself at risk? Or do you want to wait when you say to yourself, you know what, next year we're going to have a full mid-level if we want. We're going to go into the tax. We're going to get that other player at $10 million plus. Maybe we'll get a trade exception or something, add another player. So it's more forward-thinking, Clay, than anything else when it comes to the tax.
Jay and Ray, thank you guys for the kind comments. Really appreciate that. And again, if you guys have any questions, drop them right there. I'm glad you clarified that because – and Rajon Rondo is the name that's out there.
Sure.
And I believe he's guaranteed for $7.5 million this year. If he's bought out, then obviously you're talking about a minimum. So the issues that you would run into are twofold. Number one, the thing you're seeing is, just trade KZ Okpala for him. Well, first off, you need somebody to want KZ Okpala. Sure. Secondly, if he's bought out, then and if that trade were to go through, he's still making more than Okpala would.
You can't afford to bring in a player on anything more than a minimum contract now, or more than KZ Okpala, unless you trade other players there also. So you're really talking about a buyout, whether it's Rondo, maybe even Patrick Beverley in Minnesota. We'll see what happens there. A lot of these were salary cap machinations more than necessarily wanting the players. There are some teams overloaded at point guard, but again, you cannot bring in any human body, any human being additional to your roster right now without going over the tax, unless you can offload KZ. Maybe someone takes him for a second-round pick. Maybe you throw enough cash into the deal where someone's going to be below the salary cap floor, has to spend on someone anyway. You have enough money. You can send KZ Okpala's contract and that amount of cash to pay off his contract to another team and to create that roster spot. So that is possible.
Yeah, and those, but it's a lot of gymnastics basically. And you're right. Is it possible? Yes, but you need so much. So it's not as simple as just saying, okay, bring this guy in,
right,
and all of that. And I guess what I would ask you then is, Is Rajon Rondo or Patrick Beverley the type of player that would change your mind from being a competitive team to a contending team?
I'm not sure they would raise the bar that much because neither's a great three-point shooter. Rondo, I mean, he had the bubble shooting when he was off the charts, in the playoffs that one season, but otherwise he really hasn't shown it. So then you have a thing again. Let's say you have a Rajon Rondo. Let's say he gets over anything he had with Jimmy Butler during the Hoiberg era in Chicago. But if you're going to have Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo and Rajon Rondo on the floor, my God, your spacing is going to be hellaciously poor. So you have that. But I need someone to get you into offense. Kyle Lowry comes off the floor because he's going to come off the floor at some point. Kyle Lowry is injured because he's old. He's going to get injured at some point. What do you do then? What we've seen, Clay, in recent seasons is you'd have Bam Adebayo operating the offense from the elbow, is you'd have Jimmy Butler advancing the ball. But if you want to unlock all the special things those two guys do, I think you need to free them up a little bit more.
Yes.
That was the entire point of Kyle Lowry. God bless Goran Dragic, not necessarily the playmaker, more of an offensive threat than Kyle Lowry is. So you brought Kyle Lowry in. My problem is you take Kyle Lowry off the court. I don't even see another point guard. I don't even know if there's another point guard delineation position-wise. I know Eric Spoelstra doesn't want to hear any of that in his positionless world. But I don't know if there's another player you'd even say he's a point guard. The closest thing on this roster, I guess, is Gabe Vincent or Victor Oladipo. And Victor's not going to be around for at least the first half of the season.
And they tried to make Tyler Hero into that, and it didn't work.
Please do not do that.
Yeah.
Do not do that again. You've got 1 year before you have to deal with this rookie scale extension. Put him in a role, lock him in a role, saying,
Yes.
Look, if we're going to pay him for another 5 years, we want to know that he can do X rather than X, Y, and Z. Create a comfort zone for Tyler Hero. Don't get him caught up in your roster mishmash positionally.
And let me tell you something. I love Pat.
Well, I see Clay has taken his usual break during our show, so I'll pick it up for here. And I know where Clay was going also with this, and as far as Gabe Vincent and whether he could be the guy who could step in right now for the Heat and become their backup point guard. And my whole point on this, Clay and Big O, has been this. If you play Gabe Vincent, and I know that Clay was going to ask about Gabe, and if you're going to play
This
Gabe
is the weird
Vincent,
thing. Ira, I don't know why this seems to happen at 10 minutes.
Same point. Same point in every show.
I got to figure this out. Maybe I have to sign off during one of the commercials. But this is what I was going to say. Not to cut you off, but the direction I love Pat Riley news conferences for two reasons and
Sure.
the Zoom call. Number one, for us on Local 10, we love the sound bites. We love
Absolutely.
I'm always looking for a whale and there are obstacles, but there are none, like all that. But I love when you can kind of see what he's saying behind those sound bites, and something that I don't think got enough play in his last postseason news conference was that Bam Adebayo was being asked to do too much. And he was
Correct.
essentially saying that Spo was asking him to do too much, especially on the offensive side of the floor. And I've said this before, you can't ask Bam to be Giannis on the defensive side of the floor and Nikola Jokic on the other. So to your point about the point guard position, I think this goes with Jimmy Butler as well, just because they can do something, just because they can get you into the offense, doesn't mean they should,
Right.
because then it takes you away from the other things that make them great. So I'm with you. I'm going to be really curious, and you mentioned this in the last segment about how good the Heat developmental staff is and the assistant coaching staff at getting players to work on specific things. What is it that they ask Gabe Vincent to do? If they ask him to strictly be a point guard and grow into that role, then I think it kind of tells you where they're at with that. But if not, then I do think that it opens the door for them to bring in somebody, because I'm with you. Kyle Lowry is going to miss time, and that means you're then going to have to ask either Tyler Hero, Jimmy Butler, Bam Adebayo, or a combination of all three of those guys to undertake a role that they can do, but it takes away from what they do best.
And Clay, and I was mentioning this when we lost connectivity here for a couple of seconds, is about Gabe Vincent. He's sort of being cast right now as the backup point guard. In other words, if you're filling those boxes on your charts, center, 1 through 3, power forward, everything, Gabe Vincent probably shows up number 2 behind Kyle Lowry at point guard. But think who Gabe Vincent was when they signed him out of the Stockton Kings in the G League. He was a lights-out three-point shooter. He was what Max Strus might be now, or even Duncan Robinson. They tried to develop him a little more into a defender. He was very good, I thought, defensively last season. But he might be another guy who's simply not a point guard. You're trying to make him what he's not. During the Olympics, and I mentioned this in a previous show we did, The analyst who was calling a Nigeria game said, the problem is Nigeria starts every game with Gabe Vincent at point guard and then realizes we need his shooting. They move him off the ball to get him back to his spots. One, can Gabe Vincent still be a shooter while being a playmaker? Or else you're taking his best NBA level skill and you're sort of pushing it off to the side.
Yeah.
Or should you just say, you know what? Even though, as a matter of fact, this is how we started the show talking about this, even though they have Duncan Robinson as a three-point shooter, even though Max Strus has developed as a three-point shooter, you could never have enough of them these days.
Right.
You maybe want two of them on the floor at a time. That's what they tried to do with Gabe last season. So that's the thing is I'm not so sure that also doesn't become a force feed type of situation where Gabe is being asked to be point guard to the detriment of his NBA level three-point shooting. I want to see how that plays out. Again, we may say Tyler shouldn't play point guard, but maybe he surprises us in the preseason. We may say Gabe is not up to it, but maybe he shows that in the preseason. But the weird thing about the Heat clock is where they are under the luxury tax, to sort of wrap this in a bow, they really won't be able to add another player right now between midseason and late in the season. So this is going to become quite the waiting game unless they go into the tax, unless they make a transaction to open enough to bring in a minimum player. And there will always be a veteran point guard. Whether it's Patrick Beverley shaking free in Minnesota, don't think so. Whether it's Rajon Rondo shaking free, seems all he's done is be traded the last 5 years. He's played for like every team in the league. Or maybe whether it's a Jeff Teague type, someone who's still out there and available, just so you can feel confident that here's a guy who can get us into offense. Again, to me, when I do my 10 questions going into training camp 6 weeks from now, I have no question that point guard will be one of them. Depth at point guard.
And to your point originally, and I'm going to use this to transition because I'm sure Big O is going to talk some football coming up in the next segment. You hear this all the time from the best football coaches. It's, what is your vision for the player? In other words, you're going to put the player in a position to do what he does best.
Correct.
And you're not going to ask the player. And it's why you'll see a lot of times, and you see this in the NFL a lot, a player be really good on one team, signs an enormous free agent deal, and all of a sudden, oh my goodness, what happened? Like, Nnamdi Asomugha was a guy who was outstanding, a cornerback with the Raiders, and he went inside a big deal and fell off the map. Well, sometimes guys are good in man. They're not good in zone, vice versa. In the NBA, what the Heat have done really well with developing players is figure out their strengths and play to their strengths. And you don't want to be in a position where, you mentioned Gabe Vincent being such a great shooter, you're forcing a square peg into a round hole.
Correct.
You don't want him to be, and I think that's what you're saying. And so I think I'm with you. I think by mid-season, they're going to be looking to add a playmaker. Maybe not now, but when you get to the point where you're able to add somebody and not
and you know what, Clay, and they're good at that because midseason last year we said they've got to add another big body. God bless him, Dwayne Dedmon showed up. He filled the niche, so they're good at filling those boxes, the round holes with the round pegs. You know, eventually it might take some time. They'll survive. The awkwardness of it is the Victor Oladipo situation. Maybe he's your backup point guard. He's played some point guard. He played some when he came in with the Heat for his brief 1 week last season before he had the quadriceps injury. It could be as simple as that. Even if he's not on the floor until midseason or later, maybe he gets to work at practice where you say, hey, he looked good on the practice court today running the offense. We can't wait till January, February, or March. Maybe it's that simple also. We'll see how much of a healer he is.
So hopefully it's not just Heat fans holding their breath that Kyle Lowry is able to play every minute until January.
48
February, right?
every game where we're fine, back-to-backs. You know what? You got the money, now play the time.
Ira, thanks so much, my man. Inside the Paint, we do it every single Wednesday here. And guys, as always, we like to make this interactive. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for your questions. The Big O Show rolls on next. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint program with Ira Winderman and Clay Ferraro, exclusively on the Big O Radio Show. Search Big O Radio Show on most platforms. Subscribe and smash the like button to support Inside the Paint. If you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business, there's only one choice: Pallet Rack City. When you need your warehouse looking good while staying efficient, there's only one place to find the finest racks in the business. Pallet Rack City in Hialeah. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547. Pallet Rack City is the company you need when you want your warehouse sporting the finest racks in the business. After all, who doesn't love a great rack? Pallet Rack City. 305-424-8547. That's 305-424-8547.